in this.
Oh, very good.
Hello and good afternoon, at least here in the Pacific time zone. Thank you all for zooming in, and maybe as we have our speakers on audio, everyone else stay muted. I hope that everyone is well, as much as these days allow us to be. My name is Charlotte von Robert, and I'm the faculty director of the Taube Center here at Stanford, the Taube Center for Jewish Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to our roundtable discussion on contested history, art, and the politics of trauma, San Francisco's Washington High School mural controversy. Thank you to the program in Native American Studies for co-sponsoring this roundtable. And I want to thank my staff, especially Shana Hammerman, our new associate director, who is fielding the tech. And I want to remind everyone before I do my real function to introduce our speakers that you can, after the roundtable discussion itself, raise questions in the chat or raise your hand, and we try to get to as many questions as possible at the end. But with that said, it is my distinct honor to introduce our guests first. I'll start with Deborah Kaufman and Ellen Snitow. Deborah and Ellen are award-winning filmmakers whose documentaries have premiered at Sundance, and to many of you here that don't need introduction, but still. The documentaries were also screened in the US Congress, broadcast on PBS and internationally, and are used in our college classrooms around the country. The many films focus on contemporary controversies, racism, and social justice, and their most recent documentary, Company Town, broadcast on public television, was about gentrification in San Francisco, and we'll learn about their documentary on the controversy we are talking about. They're based in Berkeley, California, across the bay. Welcome especially also to David Treuer from USC, where he's a professor of literature and teaches in the creative writing and literature PhD program after having taught at the University of Minnesota and the University of Wisconsin, as well as Scripps College. To most of you, however, David Treuer is known as author of 3 novels, among them The Hiawatha, and his nonfiction work on Native American history, language, and culture, his memoir or reportage on Res Life, an Indian's journey through reservation life, and most recently, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Native America from 1890 to the present, an incredibly powerful story about Native American resilience and ongoing reinvention. There's so much more, but I have very limited time for the introductions. Welcome, David. Karen Biestman is Associate Dean and beloved Director of the Native American Cultural Center at Stanford. Karen teaches at the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in the areas of federal Indian law, nation building, and American Indian religious freedom. She has also taught in the law school at UC Berkeley and the Native American Studies program there. She has been a member of the Stanford Design School teaching team, where she taught courses on crafting challenging conversations and others through a cultural lens. Last, but certainly not least, I would like to welcome my dear colleague, Professor Steven Zipperstein, the Daniel E. Koshland Professor in Jewish Culture and History here in the Department of History. Steven is the author of many books, historiographies, and biographies. His most recent and much discussed book is Pogrom, Kishinev, and the Tilt of History. It is Steve who really came up with the idea for our roundtable originally, and he will serve as a moderator for today's roundtable. Thank you, all of you. And with this, I pass on to Steve. And if we were in the real world now, I would invite everyone to welcome our guests. Steve, I pass it on to you.
Oh, Charlotte, thank you so much. I've always sought to be beloved, and we'll achieve that at some point in life. I want to just explain for a moment how this came about. It actually originated at what is now an arcane artifact, a dinner party with our friends and neighbors, Deborah and Ellen. And they were describing to my wife, Susan, and me this extraordinary project, which seemed to raise so many vexing questions about old left, new left, trauma, historical memory, that it seemed just an important thing to have a forum like this. I had just around the same time at the Arizona Book Festival helped launch a new book side by side with David Treuer, and we got along well at the panel, and I thought it'd be wonderful to invite him, and then we were able to bring in Karen as well, and here we are. The structure will be as follows. All the speakers will speak for 7 minutes each, except for Alan and Deborah, who will speak for 6 minutes each. I will be the timekeeper. I have, my ancestors were mostly Lithuanian Jews, incredibly strict about time, and I will maintain their tradition, at least in this respect. I'll give people a 1-minute warning before they're to finish. Then the panelists will talk about some of the issues among themselves for up to 10 minutes. And then we'll open up for discussion. We might continue up until 1:30 rather than the announced 1:15, and I'll close with a few remarks, and then we'll all be enlightened. So let us begin with a 7-minute clip. At the very beginning, it actually indicates that it's longer, hours, I can't remember, but in fact, a 7-minute clip of the film that Alan and Deborah are working on, and then they will pick up just afterwards. And Shana will be fielding the discussions on chat. The film, please.
If you want your murals, I say come and get them. We don't want them. But you don't own our schools, and you don't get to decide what our kids see and learn.
You don't own any.
Over 2,000 students have to go to this school every day. Students should never have to hear, "I'll meet you at the dead Indian." We deserve to feel safe and supported.
Those murals in that school are a national treasure. And you don't destroy African American history, our Native American history. Art's role, if it's any good at any time in the world, is to make us uncomfortable with the status quo so that we can be about the business of change.
class after everyone else, if that.
To portray a Native person face down dead, you are trapping their spirit and their soul so they cannot move on. That is what this mural has done. It has trapped us in an era of the past where we are now invisible and we no longer have a voice. Our children deserve to come to a school where they feel honored and respected and they feel safe.
Now this is a slippery slope. If you censor these murals, where do we stop? There are other murals in the city which could easily be censored.
It's not a matter of censorship. It's a matter of human right. The right to learn without hostile environments. Even the best intentions do harm. One's intent does not negate all the lived experience that we, Isawi, live every single day of our lives.
We should be teaching about the mural and what it means. I, as half Native American Indian, see no problem with the mural. It depicts what happened. Everything was whitewashed when I went through school.
I'm a student at George Washington High School, and I'm here to stand up against the racist and demeaning Life of Washington murals. It's very hard to walk past these murals depicting the racist stories of America's founding father, even if it is the truth. Generational trauma follows us. If our school district seeks out social justice just as much as Washington High School itself, then we will paint over these murals or cover them.
It pains me that we will become complicit in a move to do a redaction of history. History is history. And someone said, if you don't learn the lessons of history, you will make its mistakes. And I hope that this board would leave that mural alone. It tells the whole truth about Mr. Washington being complicit in the slave trade, about what he did to the Native Americans.
If you support this mural, you have a colonized mentality. If you are Latino and you support this, you are colonized. If you are African American, you are colonized. If you are Native American, you are colonized.
I didn't appreciate being called a white supremacist because I'm for keeping those murals up. I'm speaking as an elder of the First Nation peoples of Oklahoma. As I said last week, those murals are our visual history that genocide was there. It shows it in those murals. To take those down, you're taking a visual record away.
My son always tells me when we go into the school, Mom, don't tell them I'm Native. And I can't imagine him walking into that school being told, meet me at the dead Indian. It's not right. Personal testimony. Right now I feel so angry. Again, here we are fighting for what's right for the kids. Paint it down.
This experience is evoking such deep pain, and I'm losing hope for this country that we can come together, honor all people. Serce obливается кровью. In Russian, it means my heart is essentially smothering in its own blood. I ask you, collaborate, compromise, seek a solution that honors all people.
We know where compromise has gotten us for centuries. Compromise is just another surrender. We don't surrender.
Why must we always struggle to have to explain why we are offended by those things that inflict injury on us? Why do we have to explain that the pain that is inflicted by retelling of lies in history or stereotype images of our people and nations? Why do we have to explain?
Deborah, Ellen, why don't you start? Can't hear.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I want to acknowledge first that we're on Ohlone territory here. where there are many exciting Native revitalization movements to reclaim, recover, and re-indigenize the land. And I want to thank our sponsors at Stanford, the Toby Center for Jewish Studies and Native American Studies, and tell you how excited I am to be here with you all. The history behind our project began long ago. Native peoples have been here for thousands of years. That continuity was broken by the theft of land, disease, genocide, forced assimilation, and attempts to destroy spirituality and cultures. That history is at the root of the Native parents' objections to left-wing Russian immigrant artist Viktor Arnatov's Life of Washington murals as racist and harmful. But the demand that the murals be removed and the response by those wishing to preserve the murals has sparked intense international media attention, becoming much more than a little local skirmish. Right now, we're seeing many examples of art controversies that go way beyond this and the Confederate and Columbus statues that are making headlines. For instance, the recent delay of a traveling retrospective of Jewish left-wing artist Philip Guston's work because curators feared that his depiction of hooded figures as symbols of evil might be misunderstood. And the attacks on Canadian Cree artist Kent Monkman, whose provocative, satirical, two-spirit paintings were deemed disrespectful and amoral by some in his own community. And the list goes on and on. So why make a film about a stressful conflict that has no easy answers? Paul Chott Smith, a Comanche author and curator at the Smithsonian's Museum of the American Indian, recently quoted a rocker, Chrissy Hind, when he spoke about his involvement with controversial art and artists. Sometimes you just have to walk the plank. I'm drawn to this story precisely because it's not easy. The passionate claims on either side of this debate move me, both the claims of the Native American community, whose voices are so often not heard, and the claims of progressives who want to honor the remnants of a suppressed left-wing American culture. But this story isn't simply about a two-sided argument. There's incredible diversity of opinion among the Native Americans we've spoken with and among those arguing for the preservation of this historic work. If anything, what's most clear to us is a kind of generation gap. Younger folks use the language of trauma and triggers to demand respect and change. They drive some older folks crazy with their calls for safety and security as essential to their learning environment. Older folks more often emphasize that for young adults and students to be empowered and to have agency, they must confront historic evils in the educational setting. And that can drive younger folks insane with calls to, quote, get over it, unquote. As a Jew, I understand and identify with the claim of generational trauma and victimization, but I've also seen where that can lead, and it's not a pretty place. Alan and I have made 2 movies about competing victimizations, one about Blacks and Jews and another that deals with Israel and Palestine. Working on the current project, I see that Jews and Native Americans both have histories of genocide and trauma, as well as problems with negative stereotyping. Like my co-panelist David Treuer has said, quote, "We've been imagined to death, but we refuse to act like the Indians of their imaginations." Unquote. The same can certainly be said of Jews. We also have claims to sovereignty, but the manifestation of Jewish sovereignty in Israel has meant the displacement and oppression of Palestinians. But back to the murals. There are 100 answers to the questions we ask. How does a changing society deal with controversial art? You can remove it, you can cover it, you can add to it, you can teach it. You can put a statue of Lenin in a park. You can put a monument to Robert E. Lee or Chris Columbus in the basement of a museum. You can put a curtain over a WPA mural of a Native American. Or you can add new text to a display at the American Museum of Natural History, and all these things have been done. I'm not sure that any of these solutions deal with the underlying problem vis-a-vis these murals. What I do know is that bridging differences is not always about compromise, because in this case, compromise has made no one happy. It might sometimes be about recognition and perhaps finding some commonality. How do we get there? I think a first step is actually listening to each other's stories, which is why we hope our documentary film can be a helpful intervention. I don't know if there's an approach to the very real pain that exists that incorporates Native ceremony or peacemaking, that centers Indigenous knowledge of conflict resolution, but I'd like to know. What would decolonization mean here? Would it be about re-indigenizing the San Francisco School District's land? What does reclaiming space look like in this context, and how would the creation of new art generate a different story?
Deborah,
I think the transformation of the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond, Virginia is an example of something promising. The granite base of the sculpture is now covered with the names of victims of police violence, revolutionary symbols, and calls for compassion. The surrounding area is now a pilgrimage site for a newly diverse crowd listening to music, doing voter registration, having religious services, barbecues, demonstrations, and candlelight vigils. I leave you with the questions we ask ourselves every day with this film. How can a changing society deal with controversies over art? And what does this country owe people who have been historically wronged? And in these last few days before the election, another question, especially during this moment when radical forces from the right are stoking division, how can allies honor, respect, and support one another?
Thank you. I think hopefully we'll come back to this distinction between commonality and a compromise later on. Ellen.
Well, I want to thank you all for inviting us from where we work in Berkeley. We're here as grateful guests on Chochenyo Ohlone land up here. We're very eager to hear this discussion, especially on ideas and experiences of historic or intergenerational trauma and how communities can recover and be resilient. The fragment of film you saw is by no means part of a finished film. Our filming and editing has been pretty much stopped cold by COVID, but we hope the clip is a good jumping off place for our discussion today. One thing we have learned from the Arnautoff mural controversy is that what we see in the murals may tell us more about who we are, about ourselves, than it tells us about Victor Arnautoff. One of our aims in this film is to ask, what does it mean to be an ally? From our past work, we've seen alliances as two-way streets, mutually listening, struggling with the other, and supportive, even if not agreeing on all issues. But is that still what an ally means? We sense there's been a change in terminology from alliance to allyship, which may suggest that people who have been traumatized must not only be heard, but also followed without that two-way street of mutuality that alliances require. Taken to an extreme, this can result in turning one's will and individual responsibility over to others. A white participant in an infamous Black revolutionary robbery in 1981, in which several police were killed, put it this way, quote, "My way of supporting the struggle is to say that I don't have the right to know anything, that I don't have the right to engage in political discussion because it is not my struggle. I certainly don't have the right to criticize anything. The less I would know and the more I would give up my total self, the better, the more committed and the more moral I was," unquote. This is not a paradigm that I can accept, but I do accept the idea of supporting autonomous or sovereign political struggles and the necessity of looking at ourselves and questioning our own assumptions. Are many older leftists stuck in the paradigm of civil rights, unionism, and minority inclusion? When I was in college, a small group of us met with Stokely Carmichael, who told us that we white lefties should organize against racism in our own communities, not in his. I remember how hurt and angry many white activists were about that rejection. Perhaps that helps explain the puzzling intensity of outrage over Native calls to cover the Arnautoff murals. For older leftists, it may have recalled the pain of rejection from the Black student civil rights movement. Or perhaps the anger is an artifact of the threatened end of left liberal culture in this moment of fascist resurgence. There's the fascist right there. In some of the comments in defense of the murals, there seemed to be almost nostalgia for a Depression-era hope of realizing working class unity and progress. Is it a mistake to assume that we are all minorities of different kinds, but on the same side against the man or capitalism or imperialism? But sovereign nations are not minorities. It's fantastic to think about being here with two groups of people who struggle with these issues, Jews and natives. What binds culture in a diaspora or in a sovereign nation? Do we support self-determination in sovereignty or not? And what is the price of sovereignty and who pays it? When it comes to controversies over artwork, we have yet another set of questions. Is there such a thing as a history of anti-racist art? Some of that anti-racist art was the expression of an earlier generation of leftists and people of color who wanted to expose and confront the realities of American history rather than evade them. But look at it another way. Would I want my children at school to pass by images of piles of corpses in Buchenwald where Deborah's dad doctored to survivors? Or putting it another way still, my Jewish identity is not the same as my people's victimization. I do not believe that images of the Holocaust must be constantly before me and others as a reminder of our victimization or of who we are. At the same time, I understand that the victimization was a major factor driving Jews toward the creation of a sovereign state and the expulsion of Palestinians. So the issue gets more challenging than just what to do with Confederate and Columbus statues. What is a society to do with art that was motivated by anti-racism, but that now seems out of date or inappropriate or even racist in today's terms? And then on the question of trauma, one African-American artist we interviewed told us that the open casket funeral for Emmett Till in 1955 was the spark for a new stage in the civil rights movement. Can trauma be a motivator in this way? And who gets to decide and who gets to depict traumatic images? I tend to think that artists must be allowed to transgress boundaries. But one professor of art history wrote recently that the focus on trauma and trigger warnings is progress in protecting children and decolonizing curricula, quote, contra reckless free speechers, unquote. Reckless free speechers.
Ellen, just 1 minute. Just one minute. I'm recklessly indicating that you have about 1 more minute.
Okay. And finally, after all these questions, we go back to our scene in our film, Blacks and Jews, from 20 years ago. A Jewish woman in the film describes a Black Jewish dialogue group she was in. For Jews in the group, she said, the fact that African Americans were speaking to us was a relief, showing that Black people don't hate us. The talk itself was the point. But the Black women in the group said, no, that's not enough. The question is, what are we going to do? If we're not going to do anything, then we're out of here. We think that the questions that we have to raise, even if they're not yet actions, are an affirmation of the problems that we must address. As filmmakers, that's a chunk of our job, and hopefully we and others can find a place we can operate from in action, maybe not common ground, since this is occupied land, but a respectful exchange that leads, if not to unity, then to parallel objectives. Thanks.
Ellen, thank you. David.
Hi, David Treuer here. Thank you for including me in this and for sort of making me aware of the mural issue itself. And it's been quite an education, and I'm happy to be here and share some of my thoughts. A little bit about myself, a little bit about me first. So I'm Ojibwe from the Leech Lake Reservation in Minnesota. I have a fairly uncommon background. My father is a Jewish Holocaust survivor. He fled Austria and came to the States and wound up on the reservation teaching high school English, where he met my mother and produced the strange hybrid that is our family. I have a lot of thoughts about this issue. I mean, this issue, keeps coming up. And after watching the segments of the documentary that were shared with us beforehand and also with the audience today, I kept wondering, like, what aspect of history are we hoping to protect? I mean, the mural itself is not our revolutionary history. It's a depiction of it. So are we afraid of losing, you know, an artifact of the New Deal or an artifact of our country's founding? And, you know, listening to the people in the documentary, I was struck by the fact that what's depicted on the mural isn't really even the history at all. The very first treaty between Native tribes and the United States government was made before we even had United States government. It was made during the Revolutionary War, and it's called the Treaty of Fort Pitt. And in that treaty, Washington and the other revolutionaries were very anxious to secure the support, material and otherwise, of the Delaware nation. Without their support, you know, America would be fighting front and back. And so the revolutionaries sent a delegation to what's now Pittsburgh and negotiated with the Delaware. That was the very first treaty. The provisions of that treaty, of course, were never recognized, but it's only with the support of Native nations that this republic was able to separate from England. That history isn't represented on that mural, as far as I can tell. What's represented on that mural is a fantasy about American progress, a fantasy of sort of the, you know, the ever sort of evolving perfection, you know, started in the Enlightenment and sort of, you know, running forward. So to lose the mural is not to lose that history, but it might be to lose the history of the New Deal, which I think is kind of interesting. But one thing that is sort of important to consider and that I think about as a Native kid who grew up on a reservation and who grew up going to public schools, you know, and who lives and functions in this great wide world, not two worlds as people are so fond of casting it, you know. I don't have a foot in two worlds. I have both feet in one very big one, is that I know what a lot of people don't know, which is that Native American students graduate high school at the lowest rate of any group in the United States. We matriculate into college and universities at the lowest rate of any group in the United States. And we finish college within 6 years at the lowest rate of any group in the United States. The fewest number of Native students who do graduate from college go on to get advanced degrees, master's degrees, and professional degrees. Of the something like 786,000 PhDs, no wait, sorry, those are people enrolled in PhD programs. Of the sort of 13,000 PhDs conferred last year, less than 700 were conferred to Native candidates. Education is something, as a matter of policy, that has been done to Native people, not for or with Native people. Starting in the 1890s, the United States government's federal Indian policy was to remove Native children from their homes and send them to boarding schools. They did this by threat, they did this by force, and the goal was to disrupt Native families as a way to disrupt tribes. So education has always been a precarious thing for Native people. At those boarding schools scattered across the United States, in the Southwest, in the Midwest, other places, those are really the only schools in the United States that have cemeteries attached to them, because so many Native children died at school. So I consider that when I think about these issues. I consider the ways in which sort of education has been a complicated proposition for Native people, just to put it in the most neutral way possible. And I defer to that situation when I think about these larger issues of history and community and activism. Another thing which people sort of seem shocked to realize is that, thanks, Steve. Another thing to consider is that so often Native people are understood as being only in or of the past. That the very question of doing right by Native people is a question of sort of fixing or addressing sins of the past. The fact is, according to the 2010 census, there are over 5 million Native people in the United States today. There are about as many Native people as there are Jewish people in the United States today. Almost twice as many as those who identify as Muslim American in the United States today. 2020 census is going to be even a bigger story. So I think the lived experience of Native people, our continuing struggles with education, the legacy of Native American education weigh heavily on how I think about and frame this issue for myself. So I'll close down with that, and then hopefully we have lots of time to talk about all sorts of complicated things.
David, thank you. Karen. No, we can't hear you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on this panel. I come from a long line of Cherokee educators in rural Oklahoma, but I'm joining you today as a member of the Stanford Native community to share a framework about how we have thought about addressing harm around names and images and legacies on campus. And it's a framework that's grounded in both our institutional mission and history and in the indigenous practice of peacemaking. Thank you, Deborah, for the lead-in. Both are frameworks that are grounded in values. In short, in 2016, Native student-led resolutions in the Undergraduate Senate and Graduate Student Council requested that the university rename streets and buildings bearing Father Junipero Serra's name in recognition of the harmful impacts of the mission system on Native Americans. Serra's legacy, like the mural, is complex. He was the founder of the California mission system in the late 18th century, known by Catholics for his piety and his missionary work. Pope Francis actually declared him a saint in 2015, whereas Native Americans primarily see the mission system he founded as inflicting great harm and violence on Native people, dispossession, disease, loss of culture and language, indeed genocide. Note that this is not a generational dispute, as Deborah mentioned was characterized in the film. Indeed, it is a current manifestation of historical trauma. 2 committees of faculty, staff, students, alumni were created. They engaged broad consultation, over 200 written comments, 2 town halls, focus groups with campus Catholics, Native students, the Ohlone tribe, and more. The first committee developed principles of renaming, a framework, if you will, for how to think about these issues. Among them, the strength and clarity of the historical evidence, the person's role in the university's history, the centrality of the person's offensive behavior to the person's life, the university community's identification with a named feature. And parallel to this, I was part of a Native community 5-year chapter addressing Serra inside and outside of the classroom. Students led panel discussions and other public events to showcase the issue. They were thoughtful and deliberate and collaborative and nonviolent. As faculty in Native American Studies, I taught a course on American Indian religious freedom, where I required that students do a deep intellectual dive into Serra and his writings, including reading a recent biography by Santa Clara University scholars Beebe and Sienkiewicz. We hosted speakers representing diverse perspectives, and students chose individual research topics to deconstruct a unique aspect of the Serra legacy. I also integrated the teaching and training work I do in peacemaking by hosting the final renaming committee's meeting with the Native student community in a peacemaking circle at the Native American Cultural Center, led by one of my star mentees, Choctaw peacemaker Carson Smith, who also, I'm proud to say, just completed her master's degree this fall at Oxford University with a research focus on inter-ethnic conflict resolution. Rising star, keep a lookout for her. What is peacemaking, for those of you who don't know it? It's an indigenous place-based conflict resolution framework that promotes community building and healing. I say it's simple, but not easy. It's a common sense process and a structure that prioritizes all voices and community, not just individual interests. It also humanizes our interactions. It's voluntary, It's place-based, which makes it really applicable to an educational setting or a residential setting. And most importantly, it's value-based, right? Participants determine the values and the outcome. It is non-hierarchical and creates equity among all participants, so that no voice or position or personality or identity or cultural style or title or power or allotment of time privileges one person or the other. It fosters active and deep listening skills. This is why I love the synergy with the design school, especially the empathy mapping idea. You need to understand your stakeholders, regardless of whether you're building an electric car or solving a roommate conflict. That's the heart of it. It prioritizes feelings and perceptions, not just intellectual arguments. This is key. One of our problems in a lot of these attempts in the past to solve is that we are in our head. We're good at intellectual arguments. If we can get out of our head and into our hearts, you can hear. So that's the focus of it. It invites individual and group accountability and builds community and prioritizes common good. It's not exclusively a solutions-based approach. It can, however, lead to creative consensus-based problem solving, and most importantly, to understanding and healing. It builds trust. The dynamics are simple. Space and setup are a key. A talking circle, by design, is very intentional. If you're in the same circle, facing people eye to eye, it lifts barriers between people. It physically positions them as equals. Participants go around the circle, taking turns talking about their thoughts and feelings about a particular issue. They hold a talking piece. It can be anything. One of the most powerful talking circles I ever saw was with a mandarin orange, which, by the way, by the time it got around was pretty mushy, but it anchors that respect, and only the person talking and holding the piece gets the attention. It's really values-based. We start with the question, what is your core personal value and who gifted it to you? It's amazing how much common humanity you find in answers to that question. And when we ask about group values, we find common things, whether it's students. I've also trained rising college presidents in this. It's common. They're human. What do we care about? We care about honesty and reciprocity and respect and empathy and trust and transparency. You wouldn't believe how often the word love comes up on a list as well. So students in this circle spoke personally about the visceral feelings of harm and trauma and emotional damage and harm to their mental health. Speaking with members of the committee who attended that afterwards, this experience allowed them for the first time to hear and see, to experience harm. And that was the turning point for their decision. In the end, the committee's finding was grounded in Stanford's goal of supporting the full inclusion of people of all backgrounds, and that the mission of systems violence was part of the history and memory of current community members, so that features named for him are in tension with this goal of full inclusion. They found that he had no role in Stanford's founding, that when it was created by Streets, for example, by Stanford's first president, David Starr Jordan, it was made without the understanding of his behavior or the implications, which didn't come to light until later, not unlike some of what the controversy we're dealing with now. There was doubt about Sarah's piety and good intention, but there was clarity about the mistreatment and abuse of California Indians. And while Catholic students identified with Sarah, they expressed solidarity with Native students in the debate. And speaking of nostalgia, some alumni mourned the loss of a traditional affiliation with named places, but those experiences did not outweigh the presence of a name that causes current and genuine pain and harm. So in 2019, 3 campus landmarks bearing the Sarah name, including the main address of the Stanford campus, Sarah Mall, were renamed. 1, Sarah Mall is now Jane Stanford Way. 2, Sarah Dorm is now Sally Ride House after the alumna astronaut extraordinaire. And Sarah House is now Carolyn Lewis Atneve House after the first Native woman to earn a PhD in psychology at Stanford. What about mitigation? What about education? 1 minute, you say. Yes, signage is strategically placed on campus. It's pending installation this fall to contextualize this history. Acknowledging that naming of these features was understandable at the time, the committee and the president say we live in a very different time with a broader understanding of both history and the importance of diversity and inclusion to the university's mission. But we should advance diversity in our research, our teaching, and our activities. And just this month, President Tessia Levine announced the renaming of Jordan landmarks after Stanford's first president, David Starr Jordan, a eugenics movement leader, and the removal of a statue of his mentor, Louis Agassiz. The statue will be removed to the Cantor Arts Museum, where it will be central to viewing and learning opportunities to more deeply explore this research and legacy. This is all consistent with academic freedom, not to inhibit free inquiry, but to enable more inquiry. A recent Native Hawaiian community leader reminded me that knowledge is power, but understanding is liberation. Taking it one step further, peacemaking is the kind of framework that promotes not just understanding, but also healing. Thank you.
Karen, thank you very much. Let me begin with just a few questions, and we could take the discussion anywhere that seems sensible. First, with regard to trauma, and since this is a conversation to some extent between, with regard to Jewish trauma and Native American trauma, in terms of the function of trauma within Israeli politics, it was, as I see it, those on the far right, or the right like Menachem Begin, who emphasized trauma as the motive factor. Those committed to peace, like Rabin in the last moments of his life, insisted that one should look beyond trauma. Does that teach us anything at all with regard to this particular situation? Secondly, I just wondering whether Deborah might elaborate a little bit more and on this distinction between commonality and compromise. It seems intriguing, but I'm somewhat unclear. And then finally, having said everything that you all have said, and it's been enormously intriguing, could you hint at least at what, in fact, you might do with the murals? And some have suggested that they might be covered because the building might not always be a school. Others have suggested other ways to respond. And to the extent to which you're willing to offer a solution, what might that solution be? Anyone take off, please.
Well, I can just start. First to say that everyone's comments are really stimulating to me. I think David's point about the role of education in Native American history is really fraught. I learned a lot from David's books and talking to a lot of people, and going to Mission Dolores in San Francisco, which a number of Native people compare to Auschwitz as a site of horribleness. And I think that point is really important because the problem that we're dealing with at Washington High School is, it's in a school. And a lot of people say, including Native people that we've talked to in San Francisco, organizers, activists, parents, say that if it wasn't in a school, it wouldn't be as fraught. The problem is young people walking by it every day, and the claim, which in fact is true, that there's a tradition at the school where the kids say, "Meet me under the dead Indian," as just, let's meet after school. And, that the normalization of that in a school setting, I think, adds a particular valence to this problem that complicates it in a way. The other thing is just about, in terms of what Karen's saying about values-based responses to Junipero Serra at Stanford. Last week, Alan and I participated or were on a Zoom that's going on at UC, the UC system hosted by UC Berkeley, called, Response to the UC Land Grab. I mean, the whole UC system is, on native land and is trying to come to terms with how do we deal with that. The my law school in San Francisco, where I'm an alumni, is Hastings Law School. He was one of the worst in terms of California history of genocide against Native Americans. And, you know, no one knows that who goes to Hastings Law School. It's never mentioned. So, I mean, we're taking for granted the land we're walking on and the things around us. So the points that David and Karen are making are really resonate with me strongly. Just in terms of commonality and compromise, the school board has come up with a compromise. At first, they voted to paint over the murals, and then after huge public response, they changed their minds and voted again, and this time it was just to temporarily cover the murals with panels or curtains. They haven't decided yet. And so what I meant to say is that no one is happy with this. People on either side seem to be very unable to find honor in this kind of solution. And so talking to people, including our rabbi, and Malcolm Margolin and others about, you know, what do you do in these kinds of situations? Finding a common goal that everyone can agree on seems to be a new path, offer a different path than just a simple compromise. I mean, I'm listening carefully to Karen's words about this in terms of how, you know, the outcome at Stanford, which seems to be pretty good.
Others?
Well, I thought that was covered a lot of the ground that I would have said. I really appreciated the comments from Karen and David, and Karen's approach to inter-ethnic, interfaith conflict resolution sounds like it's something that might be applied here, especially with the idea that it's not necessarily going to result in a solution, but that people can see and acknowledge one another and begin to learn directly what their histories are, why it's, for example, you know, looking at the map of California and seeing Kelseytown, what does that mean? Or Fremont, what does these places mean? There's a kind of reevaluation that has to take place, and it also goes in both directions to understand why people are really attached to certain aspects of New Deal history or of political history and what they view as their role. And these are deep sort of structures and beliefs, and they don't yield easily, but they can become, because they're tough, they can become something that is much more productive than we might expect from the kind of vituperation that exists right now.
Of course, those seen from the vantage point of nearly early November, the New Deal does look pretty good. David, do you?
Yeah, I mean, it's really too bad. I'm really regretting that the WPA didn't do more, put up more statuary, and that they it was a mural moment, because statues are so much easier to rip down, and people don't have the same feelings about statues as they do about these big panels, these big painted flat surfaces. For some reason, that, you know, and not being an art historian, I can't really tell you why, but I can tell you that you know, I think this issue is unsolvable when it remains in the realm of simple feelings, and it doesn't. There's nothing simple about them, of course, and it doesn't graduate into the realm of actual change. You know, if I were a player, if I had a personal stake, either that I lived there, my kids went to school there, whatever, you know, or if I was in some position where I got to just, you know, do things as opposed to just write things, I'd say, oh, you want to keep your mural? Fine, okay, great. How about some practical, real world changes to the situation in the Bay Area? How about, you know, if you want to keep the mural, how about actually not just acknowledging Indian land, but you know, applying the same amount of money that went into that mural in the first place in today's dollars and applying that toward better housing, better healthcare, addressing food scarcity, all these very real issues for present day flesh and blood Native people in that area. You know, like if you want this artifact to remain as it is, then perhaps don't, you know, keep the status quo, which is itself an artifact of white supremacy. Maybe change that. There are real problems that confront real Native communities in that area and others. You know, if you want to keep murals like that, you want to cover them, you don't want to destroy them, why not do what this country has never done, which is 1, offer an apology, 2, recognize treaties with tribes as in fact the supreme law of the land, 3, engage in any kind of meaningful truth and reconciliation, and 4, consider reparations.
So,
you know,
so David, I mean, are you saying, couldn't one understand from what you're saying that the fury over the murals is something of a diversion, and that one should focus on just the kinds of issues that you're describing instead?
I wouldn't say it's a diversion, and I wouldn't say that people's feelings are inconsequential. I guess being the practical person I am, who is sort of unhappy with whatever status quo I've ever seen, I would like to leverage this problem into a solution for the actual sort of tough lives that a lot of Native people in that area live.
I mean, it's heartening to meet a member of an English faculty who describes himself as a practical person, but I'll leave it there.
Well, that's my fantasy about myself, you know.
Karen, any additional thoughts?
I want to just talk a little bit about the process and agency. I've recently been contacted by some folks associated with a renaming controversy in Marin County. Some of you who know that part of our geography in the Bay might know that there's a very large statue of Sir Francis Drake, not too far from San Quentin Prison. There were concerns about that statue. It was removed. But there are also campaigns to rename Sir Francis Drake Boulevard and Sir Francis Drake High School. And in talking with some of these folks, and of course, I'm not an official advisor, but it seems to me, you know, they're dealing with similar kinds of concerns. They're also dealing with dispute between tribes in the area about who gets to decide. But the biggest concern I had, and by the way, what I did ultimately was put them in touch with the Native American Rights Fund Peacemaking Initiative to come in and help coordinate a process for them to think about that. Because what I was really concerned is that the decision was resting on the desk of a high school principal who was being lobbied from all sides, right? And if the process is the same as the structure of leadership and power and privilege that got us there in the first place, that's not agency. That's not a way where people can be heard. That doesn't promote understanding or healing. And I do believe this high school principal was doing their very best to be inclusive, but we need to change the process before we can think about the end results, right? And so that's why I think things like peacemaking as a framework brings people to table, because by the way, not all Native people agree as well with each other. And so, you know, this is happening all over the country. It's happening on college campuses, it's happening in communities. And if we simply look at it as a reckoning and that we have to fix it, that doesn't address the long-term understanding and healing, because we all have to coexist in these spaces. And by the way, I always tell people that we're all tribal at some point. We all came from communities that had to talk to each other. We had to coexist, and we had to do this without the benefit of courts and systems and that sort of thing. So if we can ground this in something human, in conversations and experiences, to me, that gets us closer to where we ultimately want to be, in addition to the really good steps that David articulated about recognizing sovereignty and treaty protections and that sort of thing.
Karen, just one last question before we open up. And like you, I came to study as an academic the people that I came from. And the world that I came from was a Jewish world packed with feelings, all sorts of feelings, some, as I've come to see, rather ugly feelings. You saw some of those feelings manifest in the demonstration in New York just this last weekend of Jews for Trump. Those sorts of feelings. The university for me ended up being an oasis of intellection, of thought, of where one could actually emphasize one's mind, where one could establish commonality based on thought rather than on feelings. How would you respond to what I just said? And it's a large question, and it's something that we should probably do over drinks when we can sit and have drinks together.
I think that's a very real context to wrestle with. And I think it's dangerous if we frame feelings and emotions as the driving factor. But if you look at it as voices and perspectives and agency, that informs a framework, because peacemaking is not just a conversation, it's a framework. It's a framework for understanding, and it's been around for thousands of years, and a lot of folks don't know about it. And some people have criticized, well, is this cultural theft? Are you stealing something from Indigenous folks? No. This is cultural sharing, and we do this. And that's why it also works in the academy, because we can frame it as a framework that has scholarly implications, right? And research foundations. Right? And so I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Is it fast? No. Steve, you and I have talked about how the glacial pace of healing in our communities, because the depths of the harm on so many sides, it's not easy, it's messy, and it's long, but it begins to bring us to a table. And situationally, I have seen it work in schools, in universities, in courts, even between murder victims and families. It can work. And so it's not a panacea, but the values associated, if we can't tie this to our values, we don't have hope, right? That's where I see is the sort of the North Star in all of this. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for all of your remarks, really enlightening. Shana will now, my colleague Shana Hammerman, will manage the chat-based questions. I'll then close the discussion toward the end. Shana, are you there?
I'm here, yes.
Nice to see you.
Hi, thank you to everyone. And I have the mural behind me so we can see one, I think not the most controversial part of the mural. I do have a couple questions that came to me in the chat, some anonymously. And so I think I'll start with those, and the panelists can respond. The first one is for the filmmakers, Deborah and Alan. What do you hope the film will do for this conversation? You're on mute, Alan.
I think the conversation is potentially productive if brought out into the public. It's taken place in a hothouse of the school system in San Francisco, and where feelings of outrage on both sides have really blocked the way for any kind of people looking at one another and hearing one another. And so we think that this is, one element of what we'd like to do, but we'd also like to see this particular conflict as something that is happening all over the place at this time. And what is a model, and what are the ways of looking at this and resolving these kinds of conflicts, which are they cover all over the map, and some of them happen inside communities, which we're very familiar with in the Jewish community. The effort to silence, for example, criticism of Israel, which was a very major trope in the Jewish community for about 4 decades, which Deborah and I broke a long time ago, very publicly, and were defunded a lot. But there's all kinds of interruptions that take place, like this one. So let me close that. So there are internal things as well as battles that may take between communities or between different groups of artists and different generations. And we thought that all of these things pop up and can be raised and then can be discussed in circles like this in ways, hopefully, that are more productive than where they originate.
Thank you. Karen, a question for you. You introduced this concept, this framework of peacemaking. How do you differentiate that framework from the framework of restorative justice?
A really good question. In fact, we're proposing a major policy lab this spring at the law school that looks at the range of conflict resolution frameworks and modes that we provide for the entire campus community. That includes mediation, restorative justice, peacemaking, other kinds of things. Peacemaking predates restorative justice. Restorative justice actually borrows a lot of the foundations of peacemaking, including the architecture of a circle, etc. But restorative justice still is closer to sort of a judicial system in that ultimately there is a fact finder and a solution that comes out of it. But the idea of bringing people together to be heard and seen and to provide an alternative to a binary adversarial system shares the values that peacemaking does. And by the way, one of our wonderful students at Stanford did a master's thesis on peacemaking at Stanford, and is a toolkit that we can share with a lot of folks on how it fits, what's the difference between peacemaking, restorative justice, how you can use it in the academy, how you can use it in the community. If anyone is interested, I advise that project. I'm happy to share it.
That's great. If you share the link with us, we can share that with participants and on our website. That's great.
I want to just add something because a colleague of ours, Ann Makepeace, made an incredible film, a wonderful film called Tribal Justice about 2 tribes in California and the ways in which they resolve conflict. And it's kind of going to the earlier question that Alan just answered. I mean, this is how film can be helpful by showing examples of things that work, conflicts that are resolved in innovative ways. So at the very least, they can, take us out of our own space and allow us to envision something broader. And anyway, that film is a great film on that subject.
I agree.
Thank you. So we have a couple comments from graduates of Washington High, and these might be familiar. I think we saw sort of visions of these in the film and in the discussion. One person says, as a Jewish graduate of Washington High School, I have a sentimental attachment to this work of art and believe this WPA project should remain and be used as a teaching work of art that needs to be preserved. And for now, a curtain can respect the tension for those who are traumatized by it. So to turn that into a question, I guess, did you learn about proposals for how to use public art like this as an educational tool and how or whether that could be effective? Maybe David could respond to that since you spoke about education.
Can you repeat the last part? When you turned it into a question, can you?
Sure. So the question was, can a kind of triggering artwork like this be transformed into a teaching tool? When it is so large and public, can it effectively be used to teach? Another graduate of Washington High says, why not require our civics classes to include a week-long section on the issues that the mural raises?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that sort of, people should tune into Native history, which is in fact American history, more often than the couple days or maybe a week that people do it in November because it's Native American History Month. So I think that's just a general thing that should be done, because you can't understand American history unless you know Native American history. So that's in some ways a different issue. But let me throw back to the people who asked those questions, and thank you for asking them. And you know, sentimental attachments are what they are. And also, you know, to the question of, can we use this thing that is hurtful and traumatic for some people as a teaching tool? And you know, I'll just respond with another question, which, you know, may be crass, but like, you know, you could, it just feels awful to even frame it this way, but, you know, Josef Mengele did scientific experiments in the camps, right? Awful, hurtful, torturous experiments. That science is not dissociated from the social and historical moment in which that knowledge was produced. You know, is his scientific inquiry worth studying? You know, is it flavored though by its context? And I would say very much flavored by the ways in which that knowledge was generated.
You know, David, much of what we know apparently about starvation studies was produced by Jewish doctors and others in the Warsaw Ghetto who studied starvation. And that data has actually been eminently useful.
Yeah. And so like, it gets very complicated. So, you know, I always like to push back a little bit, you know, by those who say like, well, you know, yes, it's offensive, but, you know, we should just use it as a teaching moment. Should it?
Why don't we end there with the question? I think that's probably a good way to end a discussion like this. Know that none of this was rehearsed. And I reached David as he was rushing with his family somewhere across Minnesota or someplace to invite him to come. Never asked him what he thought. Karen and I certainly didn't rehearse our discussion. I think this was all the more useful and vivid because of that. And now that we know from Karen that there is a peacekeeping kit that one could utilize in order to maintain peace, may all of us rely on it after November the 3rd, and that should alleviate a considerable amount of anxiety. I want to thank all the participants and the sponsors, and I've found this fascinating. Lovely to see all of you. Thank you very much.